Well, this is a follow-on story to my earlier one on drilling oil wells on the Cumberland Plateau. It's a bit longer than usual. I hope you feel it's worth the investment of your time. I think it's a pretty good story. Of oil drilling, cigar smoke, and the IRS. About a year after our disastrous attempt to improve our only semi-successful oil well ended our oil drilling syndicate, I arrived home one evening after work to find a long legal-sized envelope in the mail. As I flipped it over, I saw it was from the United States Internal Revenue Service. I had a momentary anxiety attack, as there may have been some possibility that I may not have reported all the cash income I had received from some of my, well, let's call them informal business side adventures. I quickly ripped it open and breathed a sigh of relief when I saw that I was only being audited over the losses I'd claimed in the oil drilling program. Prior to the energy crisis of the 1970s, oil prices had hovered between $7 and $9 per barrel. During the crisis, average prices escalated greatly, peaking at about $27. Jimmy Carter got the bright idea to tax these speculative excess profits and use the proceeds to fund alternative energy development. Right before Carter went out of office in 1980, he signed the windfall profits tax, which was the subject of my audit notice. The next morning, as I pondered the audit notice, I realized I was going to need some good professional advice if I was going to avoid getting into any unrelated side issues and paying through the nose. Arriving at work still deep in thought, I got on the elevator with Wayne Odom, owner of the largest Wendy's franchise in the country. Over the course of the couple of years riding the elevator together, we'd gotten to know each other on a friendly but casual first-name acquaintance basis. I was staring gloomily at the floor, lost in thought. When I failed to acknowledge him, he said, "Who shot your dog?" Startled, I responded, "Sorry, I have an IRS problem." He didn't say anything for a second, and then he just busted out laughing. As an entrepreneur with multiple former wives and failed business adventures, I imagined that my problems did not hold a candle to his IRS adventures. He asked if I had a good CPA, and I said no, and asked if he had a recommendation. He said, "Well, yes, I do. I have just the guy, and his office is on the 6th floor. His name is Leo Gravitz. They call him the accountant to the stars. All the country music folks use him, but I warn you, he's kind of crusty and more than a little eccentric. If you don't want to get thrown out of his office before you even get in, I tell him Wayne sent you." Exiting the elevator, I said okay and thanks. Just before lunch, I decided to see if Mr. Gravitz was in. As I got off the elevator on the 6th floor, I was immediately struck by the strong odor of tobacco smoke in the hallway. I thought little of it since everyone still smoked in offices in those days. I reached his door. The door contained a frosted glass pane with faded gold letters, Leo Gravitz, CPA. For some reason, the image of a film noir private detective office came to mind, and I hesitated before timidly knocking on the door. No answer, so I opened the door, cautiously peeking inside. The odor of tobacco smoke in the hall was nothing compared to this. The small reception area was filled with boxes crammed in every niche from floor to ceiling. A dense cloud of cigar smoke, worthy of a London fog, extended from the ceiling to about 4 or 5 feet above the floor. It was dark. You could barely see the single fluorescent bulb in the ceiling fixture through the yellow haze. Gingerly, I made my way to the office in the rear and quietly tapped on the door frame. Gravitz looked up. The smoke was curling up from the stub of a cigar, extending from a huge, slightly yellow walrus mustache. My eyes were burning. As in the reception area, the boxes filled the room with only a small path to a single straight-back chair in front of his desk. He was silhouetted by the dim light coming through the window, covered in a thick brown layer of tobacco tar and nicotine. His desk was piled high with folders and random pieces of paper. A large glass ashtray was overflowing with cigar ashes on the desk. I noticed he was making some notes on a yellow pad with a cheap Bic ballpoint pen. Mr. Gravitz was a short, heavy-set man with a mustache and a wild shock of gray, curly, uncombed hair. His eyelashes were equally huge and seemed to bounce around above his rimless glasses as he squinted at me through the cloud of smoke. He looked like a cross between Groucho Marx and an aging Mark Twain in ill health. He barked, "Who are you? What do you want?" I responded, "Van Cunningham. Wayne sent me." He said, and sat motionless, smoke slowly rising to the ceiling. Finally, I stammered, I have a tax problem. I hope you can help me." He cut me off, growling, "You can't afford me." Taken aback, I said, "Be that as it may be, if you'll indulge me, let me explain, and perhaps you'll be interested." I quickly summarized the windfall tax problem. I could see he was interested. The tax was relatively new and not one he had dealt with. The cigar stub jumping up and down, he grunted, "You have any records? I'll need 7 records starting before you began drilling." I told him I had meticulous records, and he said to bring them the following day. The next morning, I arrived promptly at his office with 2 transfer cases of returns and related documents. I knocked on his door and went to the back. He was at his desk, the ever-present cigar stubs twitching up and down. As I entered, he said, "Put the files down." I looked around hopelessly, and finally he gestured to the only open spot, the open chair. I stood there at loss, and he finally said, "We have an appointment Friday with the examiner. Be here no later than 7 a.m. and pick me up." I said, "Okay," and he dismissed me with another twitch of the cigar stub. I left in total bewilderment. He never looked at the files. He never told me he was going to represent me, and never even asked me if I was available for a Friday meeting. As I got back to the elevator, Odom was headed to lunch. He said, "Oh, I see you've been to see Gravitz." I looked at him questioningly. He laughed and said, "Cigar smoke." He wanted to know how it went, and I described my encounters over the past 24 hours in detail. He could not stop laughing. He assured me not to worry about it. Gravitz was the best. Friday morning, I arrived a little early at Mr. Gravitz's office. He was already at his desk. His cigar already a stub. I tried to imagine how it could always be the same length. He gestured at the cases, and I picked them up. I could see that they'd never been opened. I was really wondering how this was going to go. I put the cases in my car. He got in the passenger seat, staring straight forward, smoke curling in the air. I asked if he minded me cracking the window. I smoked, but his cigars were choking me. He never said a word. I cracked the driver's side window, and we drove downtown to the IRS offices in the federal building, the smoke wafting across the car and out my driver's side window. We arrived and were shown to an examination room about 5 after 8. The examiner shows up. He's carrying a file folder and a cup of coffee. The guy was probably in his late 20s, and as he enters the room, he does a double take, closing his eyes and dropping his head a little with a slight shake. He says, "Hello, Mr. Gravitz." "Gravitz, Mark, you're late." The young auditor asked if he wanted a cup of coffee. Gravitz didn't respond, and the auditor left and returned with a cup. It's clear this was not his first encounter of the Gravitz kind. He sat down and said, "Let's see what we have here," opening his file. Gravitz stands up, untying the strings holding the transfer cases closed. As soon as they're untied, he picks up the first case and dumps it on the table. Then he does the second with the same. There go my carefully organized returns and documentation files all over the table. Mr. Gravitz starts randomly pushing papers around, all the while leaning across the table with his cigar directly under the nose of the poor examiner, who, recoiling from the smoke, is trying to get his head out of the way. He finally points to a placard on the wall and tells Mr. Gravitz that smoking is prohibited in federal buildings. Mr. Gravitz doesn't give us any sign of acknowledgement. He picks up another random paper and asks, "What about this?" and then goes on nonstop for 6 hours straight. As the day wore on, I sat in amazement, not the least of which was the question of how 2 inches of ash could remain on the stub of a cigar and never drop as it bounced around. In the late afternoon, the examiner began to exhibit various and sundry twitches and shudders. Suddenly he loudly says, "Stop! I've seen enough. I'm making a ruling." He looks at me, his lip quivering and one eye twitching, and says, "I'm approving your return is filed. This audit is closed." With that, he stood up and, without another word, left the room. Mr. Gravitz and I looked at each other and started shoveling all the papers and file folders into the cases. As we left the courthouse, Gravitz turned to me and said, "You owe me $2,500 and I take cash." My mind was completely blown and I was speechless, reduced to simply nodding my head in agreement. The next morning I took him an envelope with the cash. I handed it to him and he silently counted it. I left and we never spoke again. I think he did well for 6 hours of work, but I did even better. A few weeks later, I received a refund check from the IRS for $28,000. I was never audited again. Thank you.